Story 1: The Mirror of Still Water. The dense forest of Jetavana was thick with the scent of damp moss and the heavy, hanging humidity that follows a celestial deluge. A young monk named Soma, who had traveled from the distant southern hills, stood paralyzed by the sight of a single charred log resting in a shallow depression of mud. To any other eye, it was merely the refuse of a passing storm, but to his mind, it functioned as the physical manifestation of a family home that had burned 30 years prior in a land far from this sanctuary. He watched how the stagnant water surrounding the log seemed to cling to its blackened bark, creating a miniature ecosystem of decay that refused to be integrated back into the vibrant green of the surrounding jungle. The structure of his awareness was a complex lattice of causal links, where the visual input of the charcoal triggered a cascade of internal responses that simulated the original terror of the flames with an agonizing fidelity. He perceived the past not as a memory, but as a structural defect in the present moment, a knot in the fabric of his reality that he could neither untie nor ignore. The monk's internal state was characterized by a high degree of surface tension, much like the puddle at his feet, which held the distorted reflection of the sky while remaining utterly isolated from the flowing Atsiravati river nearby. This isolation was a product of the mind's tendency to hoard its wounds, mistaking the permanence of the scar for the permanence of the self. The Buddha approached from the shadows of the sal trees, his footsteps making no sound upon the wet needles, yet his presence acted as a profound catalyst for a shift in the monk's observation of his own suffering. As the afternoon sun began to penetrate the thick canopy, the heat of the day started to beat down upon the small clearing, and the monk watched as the edges of the puddle began to retreat from the charred log. This natural process of evaporation was not an act of destruction, but a silent liberation from the heavy burden of holding a static reflection of a catastrophe. He realized that the trauma was not the fire that had happened long ago, but the stagnant pool of thought that refused to rise and join the great atmosphere of the living world. The moisture that had held the image of the fire was now being drawn upward, returning to the vastness of the clouds where it would eventually fall again as nourishing rain. Stripped of its specific history of heat and ash, the monk felt the tension in his own chest mimic this molecular change, as the rigid narrative of his tragedy began to lose its density and weight. The log remained charred. The facts of history were unalterable. Yet the medium through which he viewed them had been transformed from a heavy liquid into a light, invisible gas. He understood then that the mind does not need to forget the past to be free of it. It only needs to stop providing the stagnant container that allows the past to simulate life. The dampness of his sorrow was being absorbed into the warmth of a broader consciousness, leaving the earth beneath his feet dry and ready for the next step. The silence of the forest was no longer a void, but a symphony of subtle changes, and he turned away from the log with a stride that was no longer tethered to the gravity of the fire. In that moment of thermal exchange, he saw that the self was not the water or the reflection, but the process of constant movement and release that allows the world to begin anew with every heartbeat. The trauma had been a guest that stayed too long because the host had forgotten how to open the windows to the light of the sun. Now, the windows were gone, and the air was clear of smoke. Story 2: The Weaver of Fallen Leaves. The rocky outcrops of Gijakuta stood like silent sentinels against the cooling air of the late harvest season, where the wind whispered through the crevices of the ancient stones. A man who had once worn a crown of heavy gold now wore a robe of discarded rags, his skin leathered by the harsh sun and the relentless passage of seasons. He sat upon a flat, gray stone, his fingers tracing the intricate veins of a withered banyan leaf with a precision that bordered on the clinical. His internal world was a vast graveyard of expectations, a landscape where the ghosts of his fallen kin and the echoes of his lost kingdom marched in an endless loop of sorrowful victory and bitter defeat. He was engaged in the futile task of reconstructing the floor plan of his lost capital using the debris of the forest floor, believing that if he could only map the tragedy perfectly, he could somehow find the hidden door leading out of his own despair. The internal architecture of his consciousness was built entirely upon these skeletal remains of the past, a structure of sorrow that he reinforced with every breath and every obsessive placement of a dry stem. He was an architect of shadows, designing a monument to his own loss so grand that it obscured the horizon of the present. Each leaf represented a betrayal, a missed opportunity, or a voice that had been silenced by the sword. And he arranged them in patterns that mirrored the complex neuroses of a mind seeking order in the aftermath of chaos. The shadow of the Tathagata fell across his work, not as a judgment or a disruption, but as a profound punctuation mark in the long, rambling sentence of his suffering. The man looked up, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of a soul that had spent years trying to build a fortress out of dust. He noticed that the Buddha was not looking at the map of leaves, but at the movement of the wind that threatened to scatter them. In that silent observation, the man felt the first crack in the foundation of his mental prison. He realized that the identity he had been so carefully preserving, the king who suffered, the father who failed, was as fragile and temporary as the brittle matter between his fingers. The trauma was not a permanent feature of his soul, but a configuration of thoughts that he had been manually assembling day after day. As a sudden gust of mountain air swept across the ridge, the man did not reach out to save his work. He watched as the leaves were lifted and carried into the valley below, seeing how the complex patterns vanished instantly into the chaotic beauty of the natural world. The relief that followed was not the joy of victory, but the profound peace of a total surrender to the law of change. He saw that the past is only a burden when we attempt to give it a solid form in the mind, and that true letting go is simply the cessation of the effort required to remember. The mountain did not care for his kingdom, and the wind did not respect his grief. And in this indifference, he found a supreme form of kindness. He was no longer the builder of ruins, but a part of the vastness that remains when the buildings are gone. The space where his palace of leaves had been was now just empty ground, clean and open to the light of the setting sun. He stood up, his joints stiff but his spirit lighter than it had been in decades, realizing that the only way to heal the past is to allow it to be as formless as the air that now filled his lungs. The man walked away from the stone, not as a king or a beggar, but as a flow of consciousness that no longer required the walls of a story to feel complete. Story 3. The Loom of Silent Echoes. In the peripheral shadows of the Sarnath forest, where the fragrance of cedar and damp earth intermingled with the thin scent of unspun cotton, an elderly weaver named Parata sat before a wooden loom that functioned as the externalization of his own internal grid. For 3 decades, his fingers had danced across the vertical threads of the warp, yet his mind remained snagged upon a single break in the pattern that had occurred during a season of great personal famine. To the casual observer, the cloth he produced was of impeccable quality. But to Bharata, every movement of the shuttle was a futile attempt to mend a structural gap in the memory of his lost daughter. His consciousness was not focused on the fabric emerging before him, but was instead caught in the recursive loop of a phantom thread, an invisible strand of attachment that pulled his awareness backward into the cold reality of a winter long past. The mechanical rhythm of the loom acted as a metronome for his sorrow, each strike of the beater bar reinforcing the density of his mourning until the very air in his small hut felt heavy with the weight of a history that refused to become past. He perceived his life as a tapestry that had been ruined by one missing line, failing to see that the beauty of the weave is dependent upon the emptiness between the threads. The structure of his suffering was built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of creation, where he mistook the continuity of the pattern for the permanence of the thread itself. One afternoon, as the sun cast long, amber rays through the open doorway, the Buddha walked past the weaver's hut, his shadow momentarily merging with the shadows of the loom. In that brief eclipse of light, Parita felt a sudden shift in the tension of his own awareness. He watched as a small moth flew into the intricate web of the loom, momentarily disrupting the precise alignment of his work. Instead of his usual irritation, he observed the moth with a profound sense of clarity, noticing how the creature's wings were indifferent to the history of the cloth. He saw that the mind's insistence on a perfect, unbroken narrative was the very source of the friction that generated his pain. The realization dawned upon him that the gap in the fabric was not a flaw to be repaired, but a gateway through which the present moment could finally enter his awareness. He realized that he had been weaving a shroud for a ghost rather than a garment for the living, and in that moment of insight, the phantom thread snapped. The internal pressure that had sustained his grief for 30 years dissipated like smoke in a mountain breeze, leaving him with a sensation of immense lightness that he had not known since his youth. He looked at his hands and saw them not as the tools of a grieving father, but as the instruments of a creative process that was inherently selfless and transient. The loom was no longer a cage of memories, but a field of infinite possibility where every thread was a new beginning and every knot was a lesson in release. The weaver continued his work, but the rhythm had changed from a funeral march to a gentle song of surrender. He understood that the past is only a burden when we try to carry the entire loom on our backs, rather than simply allowing the shuttle to move through the space provided by the present. The cloth he wove that day was different, not because the pattern had changed, but because the weaver was no longer trying to hold on to the beginning of the thread while reaching for the end. He had become the movement itself, a flow of consciousness that celebrated the inevitable fraying of all things. Story 4. The Vessel of Ancient Rain. Along the dusty highway that snaked between the kingdom of Magadha and the merchant cities of the north, where the heat of the midday sun turned the horizon into a shimmering lake of illusion, a man named Jivaka sat beneath the gnarled roots of a dying banyan tree. Beside him lay a heavy stone vessel, its surface etched with the deep scars of many years and the accumulated dust of 1,000 leagues. Jivaka was a man who had once been a great courier, known for his ability to carry the most precious messages across the most treacherous terrain. Yet for 10 years he had not moved from this spot, paralyzed by the weight of a message he had failed to deliver before a great city fell to ruins. His mind was a vault containing the echoes of a scream that had never been uttered, a silent internal scream that vibrated within the very marrow of his bones whenever the wind blew from the direction of the lost valley. He perceived the stone vessel not as a container for water, but as a physical manifestation of his own unfulfilled duty, a heavy anchor that moored his spirit to the moment of his greatest perceived failure. The structure of his consciousness was defined by a rigid adherence to a past that had already been erased by the shifting sands of time. yet he continued to guard the empty vessel as if it still held the fate of a nation. He was trapped in the mechanics of regret, a cognitive state where the ego attempts to rewrite history through the sheer force of its own suffering. He saw himself as the guardian of a tragedy, failing to realize that the tragedy had long ago been dissolved into the vastness of the earth. As the shadows began to lengthen across the road, the Buddha approached, walking with a grace that seemed to harmonize with the very rhythm of the dust motes dancing in the air. He sat down opposite the man, his gaze resting gently upon the heavy stone vessel. Jivaka felt a strange sensation of openness, a thinning of the thick walls he had built around his heart to protect himself from the memory of the falling city. He watched as a small bird landed on the rim of the vessel and began to sing, its voice clear and unburdened by the history of the man who sat beside it. The courier noticed that the bird did not ask the vessel for water, nor did it care that the vessel was empty. It simply used the rim as a temporary platform for its song. In that moment of observation, the man realized that the weight he had been carrying was not the vessel itself, but his own refusal to accept the emptiness within it. The message he had failed to deliver was no longer a message, but a collection of obsolete sounds that had no place in the vibrant silence of the present. He felt a sudden, profound sense of momentum building within his spirit, not a momentum toward a destination, but a momentum of release that pushed him outward from the center of his own stagnant identity. He understood that his trauma was a form of self-idolatry, sami, a way of making himself important by the magnitude of his sorrow. As the first drops of a sudden evening rain began to fall, washing the dust from the stone and the sweat from his brow, he watched as the vessel began to fill with the fresh water of the sky. He realized that for the vessel to receive the new rain, it had to be empty of its old purpose. The courier stood up, his limbs trembling, not with fear, but with the unfamiliar sensation of freedom. He left the vessel beneath the tree, no longer needing it to define who he was or what he had lost. The road ahead was no longer a path toward a failed past, but a wide and open space that invited him to walk without a name or a message. He saw that the world was constantly being born and dying in every moment, and that the only way to live truly is to allow oneself to be carried by the current of change rather than drowning in the pool of memory. The rain continued to fall, cleaning the earth and the mind alike, and the man walked into the twilight, his footsteps light and his heart as open as the vast, unwritten sky. Story 5. The River of Anonymity. Upon the sacred banks of the Ganges, where the gray silt of 1,000 miles settled into the crevices of the ancient stone ghats, a woman named Chandra sat watching the orange flickers of the funeral pyres dance against the encroaching purple of the dusk. She had come from the bustling heart of Rajgir, carrying within her the heavy, leaden weight of 3 lost sons, each a chapter of her life that had been abruptly torn away by the invisible hands of a seasonal fever. Her consciousness was a fortress under siege, its walls built from the memories of small laughter and the specific scent of sun-warmed hair. Yet these very walls were now the instruments of her imprisonment. She perceived the flowing water not as a symbol of life, but as a thief that had carried away the ashes of her heart. And the structure of her awareness was characterized by a desperate attempt to grasp the liquid current and force it to yield back what it had taken. Her mind functioned as a sieve that refused to let the fine sand of the present pass through, clogging itself with the jagged rocks of a past that no longer possessed a physical form. The internal movement of her thoughts was a frantic, circular motion, a whirlpool of why and if only that generated a heat far more intense than the fires burning nearby. She looked at the other mourners and saw only masks of her own agony, failing to recognize the universal rhythm of dissolution that governed every atom of the world around her. The Buddha was seated under a nearby pipal tree, his form nearly indistinguishable from the shadows of the evening. Yet the quality of his stillness acted as a silent anchor for the chaotic energy of the riverbank. As Chandra watched a single clay lamp float past, its tiny flame struggling against the breeze before being extinguished by a stray ripple, she felt a sudden, sharp collapse of her mental defenses. She realized that her grief was not an act of love for her sons, but a refusal to acknowledge that they had never truly belonged to her, having always been a part of the river's inevitable journey toward the sea. The realization was not a comfort, but a profound shift in the architecture of her identity, as she saw that the woman who suffered was as temporary and composite as the children she mourned. The trauma began to lose its narrative power as she observed the smoke rising from the pyres, seeing how it merged with the clouds without leaving a trace of its origin in the air. Her mind stopped its circular grinding and began to expand outward, following the smoke into the vastness of the night sky where individual stories are lost in the infinite dark. She understood that to let go was not to forget, but to stop trying to breathe life into the ash, allowing the vacuum of the present to be filled with the simple, cold reality of the flowing water. The river was not a thief, but a mirror of her own true nature, a constant stream of becoming that required no destination to be complete. She stood up, her legs feeling the solid earth for the first time in years, and she walked toward the water not to drown her sorrows, but to wash her hands of the illusion of ownership. The sounds of the riverbank, the chanting of priests, the crackling of wood, the distant barking of dogs, all became a single, unified vibration that required no interpretation. She was no longer a mother without children, but a witness to the grand and terrible beauty of a world that builds itself up only to tear itself down in an endless cycle of grace. Story 6. The Echo of the Void. High in the craggy peaks of the Vindhya range, where the air was thin and tasted of ancient snow and silence, a scholar named Kashyapa lived in a cave that had been carved by the slow patience of water over 10,000 years. He had spent 50 years meticulously inscribing the entirety of his philosophical discoveries onto a series of delicate palm leaf scrolls, believing that his legacy would serve as a permanent bridge across the abyss of human ignorance. His internal world was a complex library of definitions and logic, a rigid structure that he had built to insulate himself from the unpredictable chaos of the valley below. However, a sudden landslide during the monsoon had buried his scrolls under a mountain of shale, leaving him with nothing but the empty air and the cold stone of his cell. His consciousness was now a fractured mirror, reflecting the jagged edges of his lost work, and he spent his days mentally tracing the invisible lines of text that no longer existed in the physical world. He was haunted by the phantom limbs of his own intellect, feeling the weight of the scrolls in his hands even though they were crushed beneath 1,000,000 tons of earth. The structure of his suffering was a sophisticated form of intellectual vanity, where he mistook the container of truth for the truth itself, and the loss of the container felt like the erasure of his very soul. He perceived the mountain not as a natural force, but as a personal enemy that had conspired to silence his voice forever. One morning, as he sat staring at the wall of fallen rock, the Buddha appeared at the mouth of the cave, his silhouette framed by the blinding white light of the high-altitude sun. He did not speak, yet his presence exerted a profound pressure on the scholar's frantic mental activity, forcing the old man to look beyond the rubble of his life. Kashyapa noticed a small wildflower growing in a tiny crack in the stone, its petals vibrant and defiant against the gray desolation of the cave. He saw that the flower was not trying to be a scroll, nor was it concerned with the legacy of its beauty. It was simply an expression of the current conditions of the mountain. In that moment of visual clarity, the scholar realized that his 50 years of writing had been a long and elaborate attempt to freeze the wind. The trauma of his loss was actually the birth of his freedom, as he saw that the truth he had tried to capture was already present in the emptiness of the cave and the light on the peaks. He felt the complex structures of his mind begin to dissolve, not into ignorance, but into a vast and luminous awareness that required no words to sustain itself. He understood that his past was a collection of dead leaves that he had been trying to glue back onto the tree, and that the landslide had merely accelerated the natural process of release. The silence of the mountain was no longer a punishment, but a profound teaching, a reminder that the void is not a lack of content, but the source of all possible forms. He looked at his empty hands and saw them as they truly were, not empty of scrolls, but full of the potential to touch the world without the mediation of a theory. The scholar stood up and walked out of the cave, leaving the buried library behind without a single backward glance. He saw that the path down the mountain was not a descent into the world of men, but a continuation of the same flow that moved the clouds and the stones alike. His identity was no longer tied to the ink and the leaf, but to the vast, unwritten space that exists between every thought and every breath. He was finally at peace, knowing that the only thing that can never be lost is the one thing that was never truly possessed.